Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. Welcome to University of San Francisco Symposium, Collective Memory, Public History, and Business Ethics, Building Cross-Racial Solidarity in the San Francisco Bay Area and Beyond. This is Dr. Liang Wang, and I'm a professor in the School of Management and Associate Director of the China Business Studies Initiative. I'm privileged to be the host of the event. The original idea for the symposium came from our observation of the recent fights for social justice in America, such as Black Lives Matter, or rather New Civil Rights Movement, and Stop Asian Hate during the COVID-19 pandemic. These racial social movements are not only American phenomenon. It is indeed part of a wider movement around the world. In this symposium, we explore the interactions between anti-Black and anti-Asian racism in a political climate where contested histories are reinterpreted. We hope that our dialogue will provide historical context for how both Black Lives Matter and Stop Asian Hate are in service to white supremacy, and how understanding these shared roots can create a common course for anti-racism work for social, racial, and spatial justice in communities and the corporate world in the US and globally. To explore these topics, we are fortunate enough to have a small group of excellent panelists coming from diverse backgrounds, and Dr. Chineri Opera, Provost of University of San Francisco, to deliver the opening remarks. Okay, without further ado, let me invite Dr. Charles Moses, Dean for the School of Management, to introduce Provost Opera. By the way, Dean Moses is a seasoned higher education executive with wide-ranging experience in academia, public policy, and the media. In 1998, South African President Nelson Mandela recruited Dr. Moses to be the founding dean of EduPark, a graduate business school affiliated with the University of Limpopo in Polokwane, South Africa. All right, Dean Moses, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Professor Wang. I'm delighted to be here with Cbsi. I've done a number of these events, and I think this one is particular interest given the tenor of our times. Lots and lots of uninformed people out acting on the streets and elsewhere. But at USF and the School of Management, we are dedicated to social justice and being leaders in that area. And so it is my honor to see the range and breadth of the kinds of things in which CBS involves itself. I have two tasks today. First of all, is to remind everybody that this is what we do at USF and in the School of Management. Social justice is part of our value system, it's part of our DNA, and we're committed as we go forward to make leadership and make successes in the world, to make sure that our society and the global community continues a march towards inclusivity for all and allyship for people, groups not like us. And so this is exciting. And my second task today is to introduce a very, very exciting individual who's just been with us since July. And it's amazing. And the 4 months she's been with us, she really has worked really at what I call the mind space of cultural change at USF. And she is a fierce advocate for DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion. And it's an honor. I'm just going to tell you just a little bit about her. She joined us, as I said, in July. She's basically the principal of the 5 USF schools, includes the libraries, academic affairs, enrollment management, online programs, international relations, diversity, equity, and inclusion, and also community outreach. And so it's a very, very big job that she has. Julia Chineri Opara was born in Edinburgh, Scotland. She has roots in southeastern Nigeria, and she's very proud of that, and we'll let you know about that. Her educational background includes the study of languages, literature, philosophy, sociology, ethnic studies, and community development. She received bachelor's and master's degrees in modern and medieval languages from the University of Cambridge, and subsequently pursued a first career in urban community development and nonprofit administration. Motivated by a desire to better understand the root causes of complex social problems in communities she served, Provost Opara returned to education and earned a postgraduate diploma in community practice, an MA in race and ethnic studies, and a PhD in sociology with the focus on Black women's civic engagement from Warwick University. Provost Opara, before she joined us, was a professor of ethnic studies for 20 years at Mills College, a small social justice-oriented liberal arts women's college with graduate programs for all genders. She taught courses in Black feminist theory, social movements, race, gender, and criminal justice, and anti-oppressive research methods. She's also taught at the University of California, Berkeley, and the University of California, Santa Cruz, and has held the prestigious Canada Research Chair in Social Justice at the University of Toronto. I just want to say that she is going to be giving us an exciting speech. This is right in her wheelhouse. I want to introduce to you our new provost, Professor Julia Chinyere Opara. Dr. Opara.
Thank you so much, Dean Moses. And thank you also to the organizers of today's event, Professor Wang, Dr. Lee, Professor Yang, and of course, the China Business Studies Initiative, as well as the Department of Public and Nonprofit Administration, and our partners, the International Federation for Public History and the Center for Public History at Zhejiang University, and everybody who made this event possible today. Good morning, students, alumni, faculty, colleagues, business and community partners, and guests. Welcome to Yelamu, located on Ramaytush Ohlone land. Whether you're here in Yelamu, also known as San Francisco, or joining us via Zoom from around the country, I invite you to take a moment to feel the ground under your feet and to reflect on what solidarity with the indigenous peoples who are the original stewards of this land means for our work here today. And welcome. Welcome to the University of San Francisco, a radically inclusive, social justice loving community where excellence is inclusive and global, where creativity and innovation are a part of our DNA, where education cultivates the whole person, the mind, body, and spirit, where our students care as much about their calling as their grades, and where we take seriously our responsibilities towards our local neighbors, the wider Bay Area communities, and our Mother Earth. I am just delighted to have the opportunity to provide some framing remarks for this vital conversation. This gathering could not have come at a more significant time, as we all continue to grapple with the disruption and trauma caused by what I'm now thinking of as the quadruple global crises of our time: the public health pandemic, the pandemic of state and interpersonal racial and gender violence, the upsurge in far-right anti-democratic hate-mongering, and of course, the worsening impact of climate change. We have been weathered by the events of the past 18 months. I think we all have crisis response fatigue, and most of us are dealing with personal losses too. And yet, the urgency of the moment continues to make demands on us. We need to find ways to re-energize, to reconnect to our purpose, and to tap into the unexpected reserves of strength and resilience necessary to fuel the critical work ahead. I hope that this event will be one such moment as we hear thought-provoking presentations, we engage in enlivening conversations, and we forge new connections. Here at USF, we are deeply committed to cura personalis, the Jesuit concept meaning care for the whole person. So in that spirit, I encourage you to take a few moments at the conclusion of this event to connect with yourself, to tap into what has arisen for you, and to tend to your needs. Perhaps you'll sit for a few moments of quiet contemplation, follow your inhale and exhale, and remind yourself that while the work is urgent, there's still time to breathe. Or perhaps you'll call on your ancestors, spirit, the universe, or just a good friend to support you in the work that you're called to do. Let's remember that we cannot hope to heal the fractures in our community and world if we do not first heal the broken and fractured places within us, and that we don't do this work alone. So in my short time this morning, I want to tell two stories. The first one is a moment in history that we may all be familiar with. It's the death of Black nationalist and organic intellectual Malcolm X. Malcolm X is the epitome of public history. Here in the Bay Area and beyond, we have schools, academies, and streets named for him. To young Black men like my brother, Malcolm is a living figure, signifying uncompromising pride, leadership, and excellence, and worn on t-shirts lifting up Malcolm, Martin, Mandela, and me. Some of you may remember the dramatic story of Malcolm X's death as recounted in Spike Lee's movie of the same name. On February 21st, 1965, Malcolm headed to the Audubon Ballroom in northern Manhattan for a meeting of his newly founded Organization of Afro-American Unity. Shortly after he came out on the stage and began his remarks, a scuffle broke out, distracting his bodyguards and allowing a man to break through and shoot him in the chest with a sawn-off shotgun. In the movie, you see Malcolm crash backwards into the chairs behind him, and later we see him draw his last breath. A few years after watching that movie, I had the opportunity to get to know a less well-known civil rights leader, Yuri Kochiyama. I encountered Yuri in the late 1990s at a demonstration outside of a Central Valley women's prison. Frail and using a walker, Yuri Kochiyama protested slowly and with great dignity against inhumane treatment and unnecessary deaths in custody. As we lifted our voices to chant and sing, the women inside the prison later said they could hear us and their hearts were lifted to know that they were not alone. Yuri Kochiyama was born in San Pedro in California to Japanese immigrant parents, and she studied English, journalism, and art at junior college. In 1943, under President Roosevelt's Executive Order 1966, Kochiyama and her family were sent to concentration camp in Jerome, Arkansas for 2 years. Yuri's consciousness was transformed by this experience. She insisted later that all forms of oppression and state violence are interconnected. In the early 1960s, she became active in the Asian American, Black, and Third World movements for civil and human rights, ethnic studies, and against the war in Vietnam. Yuri was the founder of Asian Americans for Action, and she sought to build an Asian American movement that would link itself to the struggle for Black liberation. In 1963, she joined Malcolm's Organization for Afro-American Unity, and she worked tirelessly for racial justice and human rights until her death in 2014 at the age of 93. Yuri was close friends with Malcolm. In fact, she told me the day Malcolm was shot, she was right there on the stage, and she cradled his head as he lay bleeding out on the stage floor. Wait a moment, I saw the movie, and I didn't see a small Asian American woman anywhere on the stage, let alone holding Malcolm's head as he lay dying. Yuri was in her late 80s when she shared this story, so perhaps she was confused. I turned to Google, and there, in photos from Life magazine, was a diminutive Japanese woman in her signature glasses, cradling Malcolm's head on the stage. Malcolm X exemplifies Black power, autonomy, and independence. For young Black people, his story, as popularly told, suggests that liberation will never come from working with outsiders. But instead, Black people need to rely on ourselves and to create our own businesses, educational institutions, and political movements. How would it change our understanding of Black liberation to reflect on the close friendship of Yuri and Malcolm, to consider that his anti-war, anti-imperialist, and anti-sexist stances, for example, may have been influenced by late-night talks over coffee, during which Yuri perhaps shared her struggle to find a voice in a male-dominated movement, or her family's experiences of internment. What would change if today's youth activists looked at the ways in which he and other Black nationalists actually fostered solidarities across racial lines? What if the t-shirt said, Malcolm, Martin, Yuri, and me? Or Malcolm, Dolores, Yuri, and me? How would that change our understanding of the possibilities for cross-racial organizing, the role of women of color in transformative action, and the strategies we should adopt to bring about change? I encourage all of us here today to consider the ways in which the collective memory that shapes our visions of freedom and the ideas we have about who we should trust and who we should build solidarity with is shaped by the telling and retelling of stories that may in fact be incomplete. Perhaps, like Spike's erasure of an Asian American woman who didn't fit his movie's narrative, they've been massaged, simplified, airbrushed, if you will. Let's make books like Frederick Douglass Opie's Upsetting the Apple Cart, Black Latino Coalitions in New York City from Protest to Public Office, or Laura Pulido's Black, Brown, Yellow, and Left, Radical Activism in Los Angeles, or Afro-Asia, Revolutionary, Political, and Cultural Connections between African Americans and Asian Americans, edited by Fred Ho and Bill Mullen, required reading. Let's learn about these hidden histories of cross-racial solidarity, generosity, love, and resistance. and create new collective memories that are shared across racial lines. Thank you for joining us today. I look forward to the rich conversations ahead of us and to learning from you. And now I will turn it over to Dr. Richard Gregory Johnson III, Professor and Department Chair for the Department of Public and Nonprofit Administration at the School of Management here at USF, who, after a brief pause, will introduce our panelists. Thank you.
Thank you, Provost Sabara, for those wonderful and insightful words and also lived experiences. We all benefit from what you've just shared with us this morning. It's indeed my honor and my pleasure to moderate this panel for CBSI, where the work that the center is doing is incredible. But to continue in the words of our provost, we have assembled a wonderful panel this morning. Each of the panelists will have 10 minutes to give their presentation. And at the conclusion of the total panel, we will then take audience questions. And to begin with us today, we have Thomas Colvin, President, International Federation for Public Policy History. Professor Colvin.
Thank you. Just gonna share some slides that I've prepared. So you should be able to see my slide. Thank you very much. I'm thrilled to be with you tonight because where I am in Luxembourg, a tiny country in Europe, it's already nighttime. I'm very happy to be with you and have the huge challenge to talk about public history in 10 minutes with this title of Making History Together, International Public History. So I'm an historian and I've been teaching, I've been practicing public history for more than 10 years in the US and now in Europe. And it is extremely challenging, but also very rewarding. So I wanna emphasize a couple of things about public history. First, as Powell mentioned, public history in San Francisco, there's also public history all around the world. And the International Federation for Public History is actually connecting many projects of people doing history together. You here have a map of just courses and university programs of public history outside the United States. And you see how people have been struggling to do history together in Latin America, in Europe, in Africa, in Asia. And public history is one of the big questions on how to do history together today. Public history means basically two things. One is doing history for large audiences. So not only historians or peers, but also for everyday people, right? For communities, for decision makers. But even more challenging is to do history with a variety of different partners, groups, associations, individuals. And that's why I want to talk about tonight, working with different partners. Because, and this is a quote from some Indian colleagues in Bangalore, working with different groups and different communities brings new engagement with the past. And it helps us to create new understandings of the past, so making history richer, more diverse. And working with people experience is something that for a long time has been kind of unnatural for historians. So there is a change, but there's also some challenges in working with different people, with different groups and different associations. This is a few keywords of the specifics of doing public history with people. And I want to talk about some cases all around the world, maybe not in the US, because you're more familiar with the US, but some cases in Brazil, some cases in Poland about the difficulty of working with different groups and associations. So working with people and sharing authority has been at the core of public history for the last 20 or 30 years. And this is something we strongly encourage colleagues and community to do, to share authority, because sharing authority, sharing knowledge helps to make history more complex and to enrich the narratives, especially for communities and groups of people who have been underrepresented. And this is a wonderful book that you can see on the left from Michel Trujillo about silencing the past and the fact that historians, archivists, curators have, by selection, by construction of history, also silenced people. By doing public history and by sharing authority with people and groups who have been underrepresented, we try to make history richer and more inclusive. And inclusion, accessibility is at the core of public history. So historians, as I said, traditionally did not share authority, right? We like to be our own boss and go to the archives and deciding what topics we want to deal with. In public history, collaboration is key. So we work with local historians, we work with witnesses, with people who have been living that kind of history. And we have an expertise, right? They have a living tradition expertise. They have knowledge. And this is a picture of a museum in Chicago in which indigenous populations become curators. So not only the sources of interviews or collect, but curators helping to curate the collection in the museum, right? By sharing authority with more traditional curators. This is one example of what shared authority can look like in practice. But, and this is something we want to talk about tonight, it's also challenging. And sharing authority is very contested and sometimes denied. And this is something that the International Federation for Public History has been trying to help with, to connect people in Latin America, in Asia, in Africa, who are struggling with censorship, with pressure, with political pressure. There's this famous exhibition in the United States about the Enola Gay exhibition in 1995, when groups of veterans disagreed with the exhibition and forced the exhibition and the museum, the National Museum, to dismiss and to give up the exhibition under the pressure of a group. But there are more and more examples of political pressure. Just two examples that I think have been at the core of our discussion. One is from Poland, where since 2015, the new, I would say, more patriotic and nationalistic government has attempted to rewrite the history of World War II. And in 2018, the new Museum of the Second World War was revamped and reinterpreted by the new government. The staff was dismissed, and the International Federation for Public History was very much active into helping the staff and historians under pressure in Poland. But we see other political pressure for other countries, especially in Brazil, but it's not the only case, where the simple fact of doing history has become very controversial because of a very dominant and very controlled narrative from the states. So we've been working with archivists, with museums to help preserve those multiple interpretations of the past that disagree with Brazil's government. So we see a lot of pressure for public history in those contexts. But there's also the question of when historians do not want to work with some part of the public. A few years ago, I was teaching, Confederate monuments. I was teaching in Colorado and I was teaching in Louisiana. And the question is, whom do you work with, right? And there was the question of what about white supremacists who are part of the public? So the question is, do you share authority with members of the public? Whom do you work with? So we didn't work with the white supremacists for our class on Confederate monuments, but that raises question about what are the limits of shared authority and with whom do you share or with whom do you not share authority. And so we've been working on, and that's going to be my final slide, we've been working on some public history ethics, and I know that ethics is very much part of the topic of this discussion today. I think the one thing is that exclusive ownership of the past is a dangerous way. So we've been working on opening narrative and opening to multiple perspectives of the past. I think it's very important in countries where the state is very much controlling the official narrative. So we've been working to enrich the narrative and to give the floor to underrepresented voices in telling not only their history, but also the history of their country. And there are other types of ethics that we've been very careful with. Going back to the production of knowledge and distinguishing between knowledge and opinion. So obviously, historians have been very keen in developing methodology to work with people on sources, on critical understanding of the past. And I think this is also perhaps the last aspect I want to deal with. Public history is also about shared values. I think working with people, with partners, with groups, raises question about what are our shared values, not only historical values, but what do we do history for? And the words from the Powell at the beginning about the democratization of the process and social justice of underrepresented voices in the production of public history is very much present in our work. So without further ado, I will stop here and give back the floor to the chair. Thank you for your attention.
Wonderful. That was fabulous, Thomas. And may I ask, what time is it in Luxembourg?
It is 7:30 p.m.
Wow. Well, again, we're so honored that you would spend part of your evening with us. And again, thank you for those wonderful words and wonderful presentation. And Thomas, just for those who may be interested in your PowerPoint, would you be willing to share it with folks if they are interested?
Of course, it's all about sharing. So that would be very much my pleasure.
Excellent. That's the spirit. Thank you so much. And we're going to, now I'm just consulting my technical folks. Okay. All right. So we're now ready for Lena Lee. And let's see. Lena, are you on? You can put yourself on camera. And while Lena is doing that, I would like to share with everyone that the entirety of this panel was actually Lena's idea, who came to a group of us last summer, myself and Shawa and Liang, and posed the idea of this panel, which we all thought was just a fabulous idea. So we're so pleased that it has come together and that all of you have joined us. And now we'll have Lena. Lena, I'm sorry, there's some technical difficulty on her end. No, Lena, are you able to hear us?
Hello, everybody. Can you hear me all right?
Yes, Dr. Lee, are you able to? We can hear you.
Sometimes I can't hear anything.
Okay. Okay. So she can't hear anything. Okay, we're gonna switch to another speaker and then let our tech folks work that out. So we're going to move to Ella Zhang, Partnership Chair of Asian American Litigation and Finance Practice Group, Sanford Heiser Sharp LLP. Ella, it's so good to have you.
Thank you, Richard. Hi, everybody. Good morning from San Francisco. Thank you for being here with us. And, I want to thank CBSI for inviting me into this really meaningful conversation. As Richard mentioned, I am an employment litigator working in the San Francisco office of Sanford Heiser Sharp, a national civil rights and public interest litigation law firm. I represent employees against companies in various employment disputes. And I'm also a graduate of Zhejiang University and a good friend with the University of San Francisco. So this forum really feels like home to me. And, the issues that we discussed today are something that's near and dear to my heart. So thank you again for having me here. As an employment rights attorney, I spend a lot of time listening to stories. And these stories tend to be deeply personal accounts of the mistreatment and discrimination that occurs far too frequently in the workplace. Oftentimes, they include details regarding the worst moments in people's lives. People describe to me comments and actions ranging from micro to macro aggressions, disparate treatment in the form of exclusion and stereotyping, and wrongful termination based on aspects of their identities that they cannot and should not need to control. They talk about the pain and anger these experiences cause them to feel and the retaliation they faced upon briefly bringing up the issues to HR or the management. It can be very distressing to hear about all the atrocious ways companies treat their employees of color. But my job is to not allow that distress to turn into passivity. Instead, I aim to taking everything my clients share with me and convert their stories into a means by which to hold these employers accountable for their actions. I negotiate and litigate on behalf of individuals and classes with the goal of helping people reclaim their voice in the workplace and in the face of the very companies that attempted to silence them. My job is to do what I can to give people back their power. And the tool I use to do this is the law, which means that my client's recourse is often subject to and constrained by the very same structures of bias and racism that brought them to me in the first place. So according to the National Association for Law Placement, in 2019, only 25.44% of associates and 9.55% of law firm partners in America were people of color. Asian lawyers are severely underrepresented, making up only 12.17% of the associates and 3.89% of partners. And Black lawyers are even less common. Owning 4.76% of associates and 1.97% of partners are Black. According to the Portrait of Asian Americans in the Law Project, led by Justice Goodwin Liu, Asian Americans have made representational progress in the legal profession over the past decade, but statistically still struggle to access leadership positions within law firms. The data pertaining to Black representation shows that little progress has been made over the past decade. While 4.66% of law firm associates were Black in 2009, the number had only increased to 4.76% by 2019, a mere 0.1% increase over 10 years. So my work acts both within and upon systems of racist discrimination in the workplace. In order to elaborate on this concept, let's take a step back and talk about the foundations of American employment law. United States culture places a tremendous emphasis on work. From a very early age, we ask our children, what do you want to be when you grow up? And what do we expect for their answer? Not where they want to live, or what hobbies they want to develop, or if they'd like to be married or become a parent. No, none of that. We want to know what kind of work they will do. We teach kids that what they will be can be equated to the job they will perform. And from then on, we largely live our lives on that basis. 5 days a week, the majority of our waking hours are spent at work. Some of us find we interact with our colleagues more than we do with family and friends. So it's extremely important that we feel comfortable, valued, and respected in the workplace. But in many, many ways, employment law is not written in a way that reflects that goal. For example, due to most employment relationships being at will, there are very few illegal justifications for termination. Much of my job revolves around two of them: discrimination and retaliation. All of my clients have experienced some form of discrimination. Almost all of them have also been retaliated against for speaking up for themselves. In order to represent my clients in these claims, I need an understanding of the different forms that discrimination takes and the distinct ways in which various aspects of identity are stereotyped. I have to be able to recognize the varied biases against older people versus those against women, for example, in order to portray to a legal fact finder that my clients were discriminated against in manners consistent with their specific protected group. This makes my work highly relevant to the topic of today's program. In order to offer my clients the best representation possible, I have to look at their individual cases within the broader context of our deeply flawed society. I cannot tell the story of an Asian American client in exactly the same way that I would tell the story of a Black client, because the systems that oppress Asian and Black people in this country are related but distinct. The stereotypes surrounding Asian Americans are in some ways the polar opposite of those faced by Black Americans. Asian people are often subject to the model minority myth and therefore expected to be good, to work in white-collar professions, abide by all laws, and hold no criminal record. On the other hand, Black people are more likely to be depicted as dangerous or unlawful. Because the racist stereotypes of these groups are generally so far from each other, workplace discrimination against Black people and Asian people often look very different, and the framing necessary to legally demonstrate disparate treatment sometimes varies as a result. At other times, though, I find that my Black and Asian clients experience remarkably similar treatment, even as the discrimination they face stems from highly distinct narratives about their respective races. This is often the case with women, for example. A Black woman might be labeled as aggressive by a supervisor because he expected her to act that way. An Asian woman might be called aggressive because he expected her not to. In both cases, the same term is utilized in a racist manner, but in order to help a fact finder recognize that racism, I, as a lawyer, have to reference and draw upon unique histories of oppression. Asian women and Black women are stereotyped so differently, perhaps as a result of said respective histories. While Black women have often been at the forefront of anti-racist movements in America, in my experience, Asian women have been less visible actors in the effort to move toward equality. Within my field, however, there's at least one highly prominent example to the contrary, Alan Powell's case. I think a lot of you on the call probably know about this case. In 2012, Ms. Powell filed a gender discrimination lawsuit against her then employer, venture capital firm Kleiner Perkins. She alleged that the company was in the practice of promoting men ahead of women and readily dismissing women's ideas. She further claimed that she had been subject to retaliations in the wake of her affairs with one of the firm's partners. During the litigation, she was terminated and thereafter added wrongful termination to her list of claims. The case proceeded all the way through trial. Unfortunately, in 2015, the jury decided in favor of her employer, Kleiner Perkins. It wasn't a result that plaintiff side lawyers like myself would have wanted to see, but the impact was made regardless. In larger numbers than ever before, women in tech began using the legal system to come forward publicly about the discrimination they faced. The increase in these types of cases became known as the Powell effect, as more and more women throughout the tech industry took on their Silicon Valley employers through legal action. Despite her loss in the courtroom, Ms. Powell's bravery in publicly suing a powerful firm made her an inspiration and a catalyst for change within the fields of both tech and employment law. And yet, this well-deserved status did not protect Ms. Powell from the ire of the internet when he stepped into her next role as the CEO of Reddit. In that position, she continued to serve as an advocate for women by banning revenge porn on the site and eliminating subreddit forums that spurn offline harassment. These actions were not received well by certain site users who instigated an internet campaign against Ms. Powell that became so pervasive and ugly that it finally resulted in her resignation from the company. While much of this can likely be attributed to the substantial changes Ms. Powell made to the Reddit interface, it's impossible to separate the public reaction to decisions she made as CEO from the public reaction to a powerful Asian American woman and advocate for women's empowerment in the workplace. This runs in parallel to my earlier example of the way in which the word aggressive might be differently leveraged against Black versus Asian women to achieve the same discriminatory result. The case of Ellen Powell shows that while Black women fighting for equality might be targeted for their activism because the world expects them to be such formidable actors in the anti-racist movement, similarly engaged Asian women might face backlash because the world expects them not to be. And the Ellen Powell matter is also particularly relevant to my work in that her case represents an intersection between tech and law. I'm based in the San Francisco Bay Area, so the majority of my clients work for big tech companies and prominent financial institutions. Having spent many years in this position, I can confidently say that it would be difficult to find a clearer representation of the distinctions between anti-Asian and anti-Black workplace discrimination than which can be seen in the tech industry. Many of my Asian clients in tech report feeling that while they are able to find jobs within their fields, it's exceedingly difficult to gain the respect of their supervisors and rise through the ranks of their respective companies. Time and time again, they are hired on the assumption that they will be highly skilled technical employees who will abide by all the rules and work diligently, yet do little less. Again, the model minority myth at play here. And they are not expected to command rooms or disagree with higher ups, and when they do, they are perceived as combative. Because their actions run counter to employers' presumptions, when they don't make a lot of noise, however, they fit within the manager's biases regarding their racial group, which leads employers to perceive any quietness at a heightened level. This often manifests in supervisors reporting that their Asian and Asian American subordinates have poor communication skills or interpersonal skills. And the data back up my clients' anecdotal experiences. In 2015, Asian people outnumbered white people in the Bay Area tech workforce, but were half as likely as their white counterparts to become executives and held just over a third number of executive jobs. That Asians and Asian Americans are overrepresented in the lower level of tech companies' jobs skews the data because employers can escape scrutiny by showing that they are hiring people of color while quietly denying them the opportunities to advance their careers. The situation for Black people in tech is quite different. Absent the model minority myth, Black people struggle to find jobs at all, let alone executive positions. In 2020, a survey of 57 of the biggest tech companies in the US revealed that at 67% of those tech employers, Black people make up less than 5% of the workforce. While Asians and Asian Americans face oppressive structural discrimination at the executive level, Black Americans often do not even get into the door. While the mechanisms of anti-Asian and anti-Black racism may look different, they are part of the same system, both serving to uphold white supremacy and the status quo of the power dynamics. Every day, I work on behalf of those who have faced these struggles by listening to their stories. And symposiums like this are an important way for everyone in attendance to do the same. Because remember, racism, in no matter what form, thrives in silence, and we have to work together. thank you everyone for being here and having this conversation. And Richard, I'll turn it back to you now.
Thank you, Ella. That was fabulous. And, thank you so much for the work that you do. It really is very inspiring. And I feel a movie coming out of this, or a book coming out of this, or something. So we should talk.
Thank you. Look forward to it.
Yeah, that was fabulous. Thank you. And I've just been notified by my tech folks that Lena Lee is still not able to join us because of technical issues. So hopefully she will be able to do so before the panel ends. But we're going to move on now to William Wee, who is no stranger to CBSI. He's done a number of events with us, and we're delighted that he's back with us. William is professor of Yuri University, excuse the pronunciation, and president in Hong Kong, Canada Business Association in Edmonton, Canada. So again, a very geographically diverse panel this morning. So thank you and welcome, William.
Thank you. Thank you for Richard. And I want to thank USF, CBSI for inviting me for doing this presentation on from a Canadian perspective, particularly coming from the Chinese Canadian perspective, looking at the DEI and also the collective memory from the historical movements. My presentation will be based on a research project I did with one of my students not long ago, just before the COVID. And we added up some other thoughts during the COVID time. And also I contributed quite a lot for an organization called Action Chinese Canadian Together to look at the issues of ending Asian racism. So I want to first starting from looking at some of the data, particularly we collected for the past 150 years of Chinese presence in Canada. And we are using secondary sources through cultural centers, through news agencies, for example, library archives, statistic sources, and also public institutions. And what we found interesting is that the first Chinese migration to the geographical lands known today as British Columbia actually dates back to the late 18th century. But we want to focus on the time frame of approximately 1858, when the Chinese first appeared to Canada's west coast in a large number, around 15,000 of them. And interestingly enough, they actually migrated either from San Francisco, which is today's California, or directly from China itself, in order to seek opportunities at the discovery of gold mining in the BC Fraser River. So Chinese workers actually also recruited from China directly to complete Canadian Pacific Railway in BC and Alberta, which responding at that time to the area's labor shortage. Due to the lower wage paid to Chinese workers and involvement about 5,000 workers from China directly and also from the United States, it was estimated it's reduced, actually the project reduced the cost of building the Pacific Railway to Canadian dollar 5 million in the late 1800s, which equals $175 million today, which is a great contribution of Chinese Canadian to this country. And even before Canada was founded in 1867. So some people argue people from the Chinese origin actually belong to one of the founding fathers of the Canadian Confederation. But here comes to the critical part of the racism and systematically from the, what dates back to 150 years, 200 years ago. And in addition, among these Chinese skilled workers, they were very experienced, working to build a railway also in the United States. Some of them actually built railway in the States and moved to Canada, leading to a quicker completion of the railway and expansion of the Canadian economy. And the data we found is consider immigration of Chinese to the more general area of West Canada, today's, British Columbia and Alberta. Chinese Canadian make up today the largest non-European ethnic origin in the country of Canada, with about 1.77 billion. I'm very proud of one of them, which representing 5% of the overall population. And the community of Chinese Canadians also growing very fast and considerably faster than the overall population. 80% of Canada's Chinese community lives in British Columbia and Ontario today. People of Chinese origin made up 6% of all university graduates in engineering, applied sciences, mathematics, physics, computer science, even about 20% today in the workforce. And 76% of, which is actually a large majority of Canadians of Chinese origin, feel a very strong sense of belonging to Canada as a country, with the majority also active very much in the Canadian society as professionals, as lawyers, engineers, professors. However, over 1 in 3 out of 30% Canadians of Chinese origin reported they had experienced discrimination or unfair treatment based on their ethnicity, race, languages, or even simply accent. I think I always tell my students and my kids, I'm okay with a strong accent because I speak a different language. Obviously, I should be proud in a way that I have slightly accent. And in this sense, the majority of those who experienced discrimination basically say they felt it was based on their race, skin color, and 50% said the discrimination took place at work, in school, or when they applying for a job or promotion, particularly for a higher level of positions. And also historically, since Confederation, as I pointed out before, Chinese Canadians have been singled out for discriminatory exclusion. This was reflected by the Chinese Exclusion Act. Remember when I'm talking about the Canadian Pacific Railway's construction, basically finished in 1885 after about 30 years contribution from the Chinese workers along with workers from the European countries. Some of the Chinese Canadian started to migrate towards east part and central of Canada, which is today's Alberta, for job opportunities. And also due to the railroad completion, the government of Canada at that time responds to escalating Canadian residents' fear of cheap Chinese laborers taking jobs by enacting Chinese Immigration Act, which I highlighted before, and put on a head tax for Chinese for 24 years, starting with a charging of $50 until in 1892, around $500, which equals to $15,000 today. So my point is that this Inclusion Act, which actually happened in Canada and also in the United States, is purely discriminatory, as not only were Chinese from China banned but ethnic Chinese with British nationality from the United States also banned into Canada. And within the 24 years of carrying out this Inclusion Act, only 50 Chinese people get a chance to enter in Canada, which means 2 per year. So this is what happened in the history for the Chinese Inclusion Act. But what Chinese did in 1939, at the outside of the war occurring in Europe for the Second World War, Alberta and British Columbia government strongly opposed allowing Chinese Canadians into the Canadian Armed Forces. They were feared they would demand voting rights after the war. Despite this opposition, many Chinese Canadians actually volunteered for military services in order to prove their loyalty to the new country, Canada, although they were often not treated as Canadian soldiers. After Japan entering the war, Great Britain began support of the recruitment of Chinese Canadians to the Canadian soldiers. And particularly over 600 Chinese Canadians eventually served in the Second World War. Additionally, back in Canada, Chinese Canadians from across the country came together and held fundraising events to raise money for the war efforts, a total of about $5 million. And right after the war, the Inclusion Act and the discrimination that Canada showed towards Chinese descent became a very embarrassment to the government. Chinese Canadians repeatedly demonstrated their patriotism throughout the war. Additionally, Canada's policy ironically violated the Human Rights Charter of the United Nations, which Canada actually helped drafted it. So in 1947, the federal government repealed the Inclusion Act here in Canada and other discriminatory laws against Chinese communities here. Chinese Canadians could now vote since late 1940s in provincial and federal election. And Canada's head tax and Chinese Inclusion Acts became recognized by Canadians as a shameful and a racist acts in the history. But however, this is not the ending of the story. In 1979, a Canadian broadcaster, CTV, aired a report called Campus Giveaway, which screws data in order to portray Chinese Canadian citizens as foreigners who steal spots in Canadian universities away from deserving white Canadians. So protestants, due to the racial nature of the report from across the nation, leads to the creation of the Chinese Canadian National Council. And this council also subsequently began campaigning against the historical head tax imposed on Chinese immigrants and their families during the 19th and early 20th century. Eventually, in 1979, ever since that time marked as a turning point for Chinese citizens in Canada and united as a way to Chinese community nationwide to fight against anti-Chinese sentiment. Eventually, only when the year I was landed as an immigrant in Canada in 2006, following a UN recommendation, Canadian Prime Minister at that time, Stephen Harper, finally issued a formal apology to Chinese Canadians for the suffering caused by the discriminatory Chinese head tax and Inclusion Act. And the government offered $20,000 per person to living head taxpayers and their living spouses of deceased payers, and pledges to establish funds to help finance community projects and education programs. But if I want to add up, not only Chinese Canadians were discriminated In 1942, during the Second World War.
Dr. White?
Yes.
I'm sorry, we're at time. Could you make your closing remarks, please?
Yes, I will do that.
Thank you.
And Japanese Canadians actually from BC were forcibly relocated and interned in the nature of national security. So if I want to summarize up here, the history and the contribution of Chinese Canadian, generally Asian Canadians, are not taught in our public school system, and their contributing, was not recognized. And this contributed to the perception of Asian as peripheral foreigners, regardless of their long presence in Canada and their enormous contribution to the society. And this also remains as a lack of representation and a racial diversity in educator and the school administration system. And particularly, if we look at today is already 2021, the current trends of blaming the Chinese diaspora is a part of the tradition of race-based anti-immigrant scapegoating, particularly in the wake of social and political crisis. So I want to add up here and let the audience and also panelists think about how these historical movements affects what happens today, particularly during the COVID time. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Dr. Wei. And I apologize for having to interrupt you, but we just want to make sure that we have enough time for all panelists to make their presentations. And thank you for your presentation. It was very insightful. It's always easy for individuals in one nation not to think about similar situations in another nation. And I particularly, something you said during your presentation particularly resonated with me regarding thick accents, because that's something I've had to deal with most of my life, being a native New Yorker and Jamaican heritage. And so I've always had to deal with people wanting to know where my accent was from. So I've learned to accept it. Now, moving on to our next panelist, I understand that Lena Lee is ready, but I think what I would like to do is to take our next two panelists and then finish up with Lena. And so with that in mind, I would invite Dennis Rudikum forward. Dennis is the managing partner and co-founder of Woolhover and Company, LLP, and I believe that's based here in San Francisco. So welcome, Dennis. We're delighted to have you on the panel.
Thank you. Perhaps let me start a little bit with some of my background. I actually spent 37 years with Deloitte. And while at Deloitte, I spent the last many years, perhaps almost 10 years, as one of the 5 national diversity leaders. I also went to Berkeley. I was at Berkeley in the days of the free speech movement. And the early days when many of my classmates went to the South to fight for civil rights. So I'm not unfamiliar with issues on social justice, civil rights, and opportunities for racial minorities and women advancing. The accounting industry did an awful job in the beginning. We were hiring close to 50% women. They were not advancing at the rate that men were to partnership. We started hiring a lot of minorities. Most of them were Asians. We too were not advancing very rapidly in equal fair amounts. I'm told that I was first homegrown CPA in what was then known as the Big Eight to make partner, first Chinese, make partner among the Big Eight. I thought that my focusing on breaking through the bamboo ceiling would help other Asians advance. It did not. I was very involved in the early phase of what is now known as Ascend. It was an organization that was created by the big accounting firms to help Asians advance within the accounting profession. And ultimately, it expanded to helping Asians advance in all fields. Ascend today is probably one of the largest, not the largest, organization doing that. And earlier, you heard Attorney Zhang talk about the challenges that women, Black women, and Asian women have in tech, and what the challenges other Asians have. That's all very true. We have tried different things to help that advancement. Asians in particular are highly represented in terms of the lower level jobs because of their skills. Asian women are among the most underrepresented in senior management in tech. A number of years ago, 5, 6 years ago, after many years of avoiding being involved in politics, as I was in college, I thought about studying poli-sci. My mother told me, good Chinese sons do not get involved in politics. I concluded that after many, many years, everything else has failed. You know, I'm told that I learned how to outthink Whitey in the San Francisco community. I was the first president of the Commonwealth Club of California. I was involved in the ballet board. I was involved with the Chamber of Commerce board. None of that helped other Asians advance. None of that helped other people advance. I concluded that I need to get involved in politics, and that's how I got involved. And now I'm chairman of a group called SF-CAUSE, San Francisco Community Alliance for Unity, Safety, and Education. And we Asians are close to 40% of the population in San Francisco. We Asians are probably over 30%, close to 40%, in several other counties in the Bay Area. Santa Clara, Alameda, San Mateo, and of course, San Francisco. But we are not, right, treated equally. So my conclusion is that we've taught, we've polished, we've done everything we could with respect to various racial minorities, Blacks, Latinos, Asians. The only thing left is political power. Many, many years ago, when I was in the Chamber of Commerce, after Willie Brown got elected, we asked him why, after he had taken and raised a lot of money in Chinatown, why he did not appoint Chinese to a number of the commissions. And Willie just looked at all of us and said, they don't matter. And he paused, as Willie would. And we looked at him, and he said again to members of the board of directors of San Francisco Chamber of Commerce, they don't matter. And he paused again. And then Willie said, they don't matter because they don't vote. So what is very, very clear is that we, all of us collectively, need to vote. And we need to vote. And in particular, in San Francisco, we need to start voting for supervisors, for city officials who understand that equality for all is important. SF-CAUSE did a study a year ago that showed in civil service, while Asians and Blacks and Latinos are fairly well represented in proportion to the total population, we are underrepresented in management, just like we are in tech. We recently completed a study that looked at the San Francisco Police Department, the Sheriff Department, and Fire Department. Guess what? Same problem. In some cases, it's even worse in that we're underrepresented in terms of total representation of all levels. So the only answer in my mind is we need to encourage our people to register and they need to vote. Because I've tried, been part of everything else, and just don't see that working. Also today, some of you, if you look at the front page of the San Francisco Chronicle, there's an article that Supervisor Matt Haney is going to be pushing for an apology by Supervisor of the City of San Francisco to apologize as the folks of the city of Antioch, San Jose, and Los Angeles have apologized for atrocities against Chinese in the late 1800s and early 1900s. And these are some very, very terrible atrocities. In San Francisco, for a number of years, Chinese young people were not allowed to go to school. And when they were allowed to go to school, they were forced into segregated school, just like Blacks have been segregated into schools. Our Chinese students were forced to do that. Later on, Korean and Japanese kids were forced to go to those same segregated schools. For many years, we Chinese were not allowed to buy homes in San Francisco. My own family had problems. We tried to buy a home in Berkeley in the late 1950s. We weren't even allowed to look at anything west of Sacramento Street. We eventually were able to buy something in the west of Sacramento Street, a few blocks from UC Berkeley, where I ended up attending. When we later immigrated in 1958, and we wanted me to attend George Washington High in the Richmond district, we spent all day Saturday. We weren't able to rent an apartment in Richmond district in San Francisco, which is really dominated today by Asians and Chinese, because we're Chinese. We had doors slammed in our face. Even today, 2 years, sometime in June of 2020, in spite of my position in the community, in spite of the fact I'm chairman of the National Association of Corporate Directors of Northern California, I was racistly treated by a staff person in the national office. And I resigned in June, or not in June, but in May of that year, 10 days before the murder of George Floyd. And I resigned saying, unknown to myself or anyone else, that George Floyd would be murdered in front of all of us, to commit myself back to diversity and inclusion and fighting for civil civil justice for all. And the rest has been history. We all remember back in March of 2020, Trump calling COVID the China virus, the Kung Flu, the hate that has turned against and attacks that turned against Asians, the attacks that happened to the Blacks. I think clearly I am a firm believer that we collectively must unite together and work together, because there are people who, I call them evil people, who have sought to divide us, and that is the way they have conquered and stayed in power. And we have to learn from the past what happened in World War II, where evil was allowed to prevail and hate was allowed to prevail. And we just need to unite, because in unity there's strength. So those are my comments. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your insightful comments, Dennis. And most of all, I want to thank you for the work that you've done regarding racial unity over the years. And many of your comments were, of course, gut-wrenching and difficult to hear, but we needed to hear it because we need to know what the challenges were and continue to be. So thank you for being vulnerable with us today and for sharing your past and your hopes for the future. We will now continue on with Rhonda Mcgee, who is a professor of law and mindfulness teacher and leading anti-racist social justice and equity educator and advocate here in the Bay Area. And side note, she's also a professor of law, as I mentioned earlier, in the School of Law at the University of San Francisco, and a dear and trusted friend. And I am just delighted anytime I can spend just a few moments with this scholar and humanist. I'm so pleased to do that. So, Professor Mcgee, thank you so much for joining us.
My dear, and everyone here, thank you so much for this opportunity to share with you just a few words in reflection on this theme of really looking at collective memory, public history, and business ethics, and really what it really means to come together in November 2021 in the United States and in a global context, right? A conversation that extends well beyond where we are here in San Francisco. Many of us are based presently in San Francisco, as I am. What it means for us to come together and look at this theme of really how we build effective movements for justice, for equity, for collaboration in service of building our collective power in response to systems of oppression. As was mentioned, I have been a professor of law at the University of San Francisco for more than 20 years. And I'm also, at this point, a teacher of mindfulness in support of, I say mindfulness, and I'll unpack what that means very briefly, but mindfulness and compassion-based practices in support of working together across these lines of real and perceived difference, working together to enhance our ability to learn and teach about these dynamics of race and racism that have been described here. And so I'd like to invite us all, as we turn toward these themes, kind of retouching into some of the deep wisdom that was presented by our new provost, Opara, at the very beginning of this gathering, which she invited us to. She suggested we do this at the end. I'm going to suggest that we do this throughout, as is, again, part of my approach and teaching around this. And that we do it right now. Pause, take a moment, breathe, feel the ground beneath us, this ground that we all share in this moment and in every moment of our lives. And really feel the strength of our own inner experience, the strength of our ancestors whose lives are here, and spirits in a certain sense are represented by our being here and the efforts that we're making, in a certain sense, to give better than we got with regard to our sense of ourselves and our sense of ourselves in relationship with one another, with the broader human collective, and with a more than human world on this planet, where we realize, of course, we're privileged to work together under circumstances in which everything is connected. So pausing, breathing, and feeling, again, the strength of our commitments, our energy, our desire for change, and the power that we have as individuals and as collectives to make a difference. Everything that has been named really has been quite moving to me as a person who's taught law for more than 20 years and taught courses in which we gathered around the table semester after semester to look at the intersection of race in American legal history and to draw connections between the legal history of race and racism and the many different ways that law and policy contributed to the formation of structures of oppression for most of our history, including the narratives through which we define ourselves separately through racialized terms and languages and ways of thinking about each other. My work has been about bringing people together to better understand the interrelationship between ways of thinking about ourselves and one another and our relationships in the social worlds through which we move. The relationship between those sort of inner and interpersonal social cultural dynamics and these systems that we're up against and that we are living through, as have been in different ways highlighted for us. We've got the systems of history, spoken about so beautifully by the public historian who's inviting us to think about what it means to embed an ethical commitment to co-authoring and co-teaching the stories that give purpose and meaning to our efforts to construct a political, economic, and social reality together. We've heard certainly from a lawyer telling us very much in very clear terms about how discrimination, microaggressions, and the like are showing up in our workplaces right now. And certainly we've heard more from folks who are now engaging in political activism to help us organize to more effectively develop and deploy power in the context of the politics of our time. All of this is inviting us to look at aspects of our collective realities, to see the multiplicity of those realities, the fact that my history is not the same, obviously, as the histories of those who have presented already. And my history is going to be very different even from others who are, in conventional terms, also described through the language of social identity, as I am often described and will describe myself, as a Black woman. All of us, on the one hand, are these, very radically differentiated, unique individuals moving through the world. And yet, as the presentations so far have invited us to reflect on, there are patterns that impact our experience, that make it legible and cognizable when we speak in terms of social identities and stereotypes and typical patterns and ways in which we are treated as members of these social identities, and the way in which those ways that we're treated bear some similarity even across our radically differentiated, unique individualisms, right? So multiple complex reality, right? We are all unique and individuated, and yet there are similarities in terms of how Black women sometimes are stereotyped, racialized, and met in the world, how Asian American men are stereotyped, racialized, and met in the world. And so the issues that we're talking about, and those are just, of course, just some examples to point toward, just to say that we're talking about radically complex realities and the challenges of exploring their realities and ramifications in, diverse and differentiated political, educational, and economic spaces. This is not easy. It's not just about cognitive work, the work of learning these histories, the work of learning the contemporary dynamics that give rise to what we call discrimination and anti-discrimination and racism and anti-racism work, although it's important to learn histories and it's important to learn the social psychology, sociology, and legal and political reality that we are up against right now. But if all we know is history and all we know is sociology and social psychology, and even if we include with that some knowledge about politics, I think we're going to be missing the broader call of this moment. Yes, of these quadruple interlocking, intersecting pandemics, right? Which I believe is inviting us to really look at the roots of what seems to be these patterns by which we categorize human beings in terms of race and ethnicity, stereotype, and rank order in ways that continue seemingly to serve, yes, these systems that we've inherited that are marked by the legacies and contemporary dynamics of what we call white supremacy, but more than that, of the ways that, as has already been named, racism and the dynamics of white supremacy intersect with all of these other identities in ways that I often now use the phrase dominator tendencies to sort of capture the ultimate dynamic that we're trying to disrupt. Social psychologists tell us that the tendency towards social domination, pervades individuals and societies, but also that societies have are also comprised of the efforts to bring about more egalitarianism. And so these efforts that we are talking about here today are about how do we organize, how do we more effectively engage in ways that emphasize and highlight and strengthen the dynamics of egalitarianism, of collaboration, of coalition building, right, in ways that might make for a more perfect union and a more just society going forward. I'll say, as I'm here in San Francisco, I'm going to, as I wrap these up, just to name that I've been fortunate since I first came to San Francisco from Virginia and North Carolina, where I was born and raised and educated in Virginia, came to San Francisco. One of my first engagements as a young Black lawyer at a time when, frankly, San Francisco was much more committed to what was called affirmative action. What did it look like? Going to places like University of Virginia and finding a student, well qualified to succeed anywhere, but giving an argument that I should come to San Francisco. Going to Michigan and finding a student like my partner, who's a law student at the University of Michigan, could have gone anywhere, giving him an argument to come to San Francisco. San Francisco's Bar Association was committed to those things, so that when I arrived, one of the first events I went to was an event by an organization called Chinese for Affirmative Action. And at this event, I was able to see that in 1993, the organization that had already been in place for decades was then and continued to this day to help be a place where we're building coalitions. And so at the University of San Francisco Law School, I work with people like my colleague, Professor Bill Hing, to further the anti-racism and social justice objectives there. We are doing this work of coalition building, but it's hard. We have to work, as the social psychologists have told us, on building empathy, telling each other's our stories, and building trust, building compassion, and inculcating in the work of social justice practices that help minimize the anxiety, the fear, the emotional and cognitive dissonance that travel with doing this work, not just talking about it, but doing it. And so I really, I wrote a book on these themes called The Inner Work of Racial Justice, Healing Ourselves and Strengthening Our Communities Through Mindfulness. And I just want to say that I'm here as a supporter of this really multiply complex task that we're about. The cognitive, emotional, and social psychological, and I'm going to say it's spiritual challenge of really effectively building coalitions to work for social justice and equity from an ethical place from here. So I thank you, and I look forward to the conversation following the rest of the presentations here.
Thank you, Professor Mcgee. You did not disappoint. Your presentation was, of course, fabulous, and I think most of all was this notion, this call to action that you gave each of us, and I received that. I've been called to action before, and sometimes I've listened, sometimes I haven't listened, and but I will listen to your call of action, as many of us will. So thank you, and congratulations on your new book. I think that's awesome. I don't know if it's possible for you to put in the chat, or if Tanya, who is just amazingly giving us support this morning on the technical end. I'm not sure if she can put it in the chat, but we would like to see the title of your book so that we can go out and get a copy. Okay, thank you so much. And last, Professor Mcgee, you can cut your picture, please. Thanks. Okay. And so we now conclude our panel with our final presenter, and I should say before she comes on that, as noted in your program, Vivian Wong, Chair Emeritus of the CBSI Advisory Board and partner of Deloitte Tax, was listed and was going to join us, but is unable to. So we will conclude the panel with someone who I mentioned earlier and is just a person committed to justice. And again, this panel was her idea, and we're just delighted to have her and appreciate her working with our tech people with the technical issues she had earlier. But this is Lena Lee. She's professor, Center for Public History. I'm sorry, Professor Lee, is that Zhejiang University?
Zhejiang University.
Okay, all right. Thank you for joining us, and I'll turn it over to you now, please.
Hello.
Whoops, I'm sorry, Dr. Lee, we're unable to hear you.
Okay, so can everybody hear me now?
There's an echo.
Okay, so sorry about this. Oh, I see.
I believe that Professor Lee is trying to.
Okay, so can everybody hear me now?
That's terrific. Thank you.
Okay, that's perfect. So let me get this straightened out. So good morning, and also good night, Thomas there, right? So I apologize for the technical problems. So we're trying to, fixing that up, and hopefully, you can all hear me all right. For now, I'm actually using my laptop and talking from my phone. So if anything happens, whatever, I hope the technical team can just send me a call, send me a text or whatever. So it's been a wonderful morning, very inspirational. I always feel the beauty of working in the field of public history is that you always have those difficult challenges and surprises almost every single day. So I'll get back to this technical problems, rather the technological opportunities a little bit later, which actually has something to do with what we're talking about today, which is very an essential part of what public history is at for this day. So today, when I was listening to this wonderful panelists from across the world and across different boundaries, across academic and also the practical world, I was thinking a lot about collective memory, public history, and social justice, and many about the spatial justice. So back in the, is that all right? Okay, so can you see my face now?
Yep, you're good.
Okay, good. Sorry. Okay, anyways, back in May, I was invited by a group of Brazilian scholars, we call it History in Quarantine, which is a project due to a needed confinement and the physical distance because of the then COVID-19 pandemic. So during that international forum, we discussed the role of public historians in the time of pandemic crisis and how history and memory is sort of interpreted or reinterpreted in the public space. And this almost around the same time, we see the statue of Edward Costin was pulled down as part of the Black Lives Matter protest in Bristol in United Kingdom. So for some of you probably closer home here, we'll see a lot of controversial issues around the Confederates monuments down in the South, and also very similar sentiments and very radical and also various, like say, racism, hate, xenophobia, and scapegoating, which was also unleashed by the pandemic. So for us as public historians, I think it's been an extraordinary time to really reflect upon how public history helps define and redefine who we are during such a great time of deep uncertainty. So across the globe, just in the last year and a half, we see a surge of public history projects was born due to the pandemic. And so here, just want to share part of that reflection with you, which the highlights is our theme today is the collective memory, public history, and also the spatial justice. And Thomas at the beginning just shared us with what public history is. I would like to just add on what he just defined. We say public history is the historian in the public sphere. Just as the provost opera at the beginning saying, we're telling the stories, we're sharing the stories in the public. So we're talking about historian in the public sphere. So we have the space, we have a time, and we have production and consumption and distribution of historic knowledge in such a shared space. So we get back to the what pandemic has unleashed. We see the different layers, or rather the complexity of history making. So we see different social groups, say, for example, Asian Americans or African Americans, or the socially or racially marginalized groups. Their histories are sort of pulled out and they need to be reinterpreted and rewritten or exhibited in the public space. So here we're not just talking about the cosmetic change in the history making. So we're talking about just say participation or whatever. We're talking about the whole system of making history in the public space. So that is the beauty. We're talking about, how this pandemic sort of unleashed the social and sentiment, and how that is going to sit back for us as scholars or practitioners across the boundaries, and to think about how to remake and rewrite and reinterpret history in the public space. So for a number of years, I've been involved in the field of public history. First start from United States and did projects in Canada and also in many other countries, and also teach and research public history in China. So here I would like just to bring us together to think about how history sort of remade in the public space, how that part of the history making is also the memory making process. So here in the United States, institutionally, we have the National Council on Public History, which I was honored to serve as the one of the board of directors in the last 4 years. So it's a national organization, and we have been struggling a lot in how to represent the indigenous populations, how to write the and bring out the hidden history and also the socially marginalized groups and how to write their histories in public. So the field actually started back in the 1970s when there was a job crisis, and so the history PhDs can't really find a job or whatever. But the climate has changed in the last half a century. So today we see a lot of marginalized social groups, and they start to fight back in the public space, and they have the sentiment, they have the expertise, and they have the venues. So that is something we're the whole field of public history has transformed in the last half a century, as Thomas was mentioned at the beginning. So it's not only about the job crisis anymore. We're talking about, say, for example, in part of Asia, the media technologies has brought us on the same platform of thinking about history making. And also in this global conversation, we're talking about not only the various in certain culture, we're talking about various across the globe and how we're going to initiate a collective actions and to really resolve this crisis. That's why, aside from the National Council of Public History, here in the United States, we also have the International Federation of Public History, where Thomas Coven is a president. So we are actually in a position and to really unite this kind of different groups and scholars and practitioners in the field or within academy to really rewrite part of the history. So just a little snapshot about the one specific culture we have been working on in the last decade, and that is from China. So we see public history is actually defined in many ways in different cultures. So in the next 2 or 3 minutes, I'm going to just contextualize it in part of a Chinese culture. So at the dawn of the last 20 years, we see a range of public histories emerged in China. And so we see a diverse group of professionals, including journalists, historians, museum curators, archivists, librarians, filmmakers, etc., work with historically conscious public to produce oral histories with the cutting edge media technologies. And we see oral history and family history as well. All social skills go public. And we also see a spectrum of modern people. They take imaginative living to the past and engage in the dialogue with the nation past in a strange and intimate way. So history is performed and reenacted in public space. And also we see a number of very creative user-generated history on the new media platform, including digital history, visual history, online commemoration. Oh, speaking of which, we back just 2 years ago when the pandemic struck China, and we have the whistleblowers, Li Wenliang, when he passed away back in January in 2019, there's an instant commemoration across the different social platforms. And we see how a handful of such activities have grown out of the established field of history. However, mostly remain at the fringe while we use the umbrella term public history, but they're not really attached to any discipline. We see the passes anywhere. That gets back to the very idea of public. It's also transformed in space and time. So here we're not just talking about the random public or on the street. We're talking about people who are socially and thoughtful responsible citizens. So here we see how the very idea of public has changed and transformed. So here, when the past is repeatedly and creative reenacted and performed the narrative and explored in various ways, and even the most conservative academics would acknowledge that business of history making is not the business anymore. So here again, we're talking about the fundamental shift in an entire process of history making. That's why I always get excited when you talk about the public history history making in the public space. Then how is that related to the justice, the ethical issues? Because here, again, the very idea of public, if we're talking about the socially marginalized social groups, say, for example, the Asian Americans. We talk about also the spatial history, the spatial justice, because it's any kind of social change. Underneath, we see there's a spatial representation, there's a space. So we used to work how to represent this kind of socially marginalized group, and in the kind of space, how they own the space, how they are gentrified or expelled from their own space. Or back about 10 years ago, I was working on this neighborhood in Kingston Market in the city of Toronto in Canada. We see how this Star neighborhood started as a Jewish neighborhood, and then it gets so expensive that the Jews can't really afford to live there. They get gentrified. So here's a spatial justice and ethical issues that are involved. There's very similar settings here. We're talking about the pandemic and how that kind of pandemic, COVID-19, sort of influence or impact the socially disadvantaged groups here in the Bay Area and also across the world. So we're talking about how to address this kind of contingent urban and structural injustice through the venue of public history. So to wrap up this is all the big ideas, but I want to wrap up getting to the essence of what public history is about, is a sharing authority. It's about how you work with the public instead of work for the public, and how to dig out their stories and using the different expertise and technologies, and how to help them write their history in the public. And so here we see the storytelling in various forms and in various skills, and comes into play. So essentially, we're talking about how to share in the story, share in the space, and to write a socially and also spatially ethical history for those who are marginalized. So, and that's the kind of idea that, I will share with you. And so I think I'm doing well with time, because I really can't see anything from my phone. So, okay.
Actually, yeah.
Okay, thank you. That's it,
yeah,
thank you. I mean, I've never done this before. See how media technology sort of challenges us every single day. But, I'm glad, I get myself heard, and, so that's wonderful.
Your presentation was awesome, and just so informative for people such as myself who are not really familiar with public history. My field is public administration and policy, so this is just a wonderful thing to learn about and to be engaged in. And I actually see a book with you and Professor Mcgee around this topic. And she has a boatload of work, and you have a boatload of work, but it's something to consider. So thank you so much for your wonderful presentation. I'm so glad the technology worked out. So
thank you, Richard.
Yes, thank you. And at this point, I'm going to invite, let me check with Adam and or Tanya. Are all of the panelists able to turn their photos on and to take questions from the audience? Yes, okay. So at this point, thank you. So at this point, I would like to invite all of the panelists to put their cameras back on so that we can field any questions from the audience. And we only have about 11 or 12 minutes. So we won't be able to get many of the questions in, but perhaps if the panelists wouldn't mind sharing their emails, they could put their emails in the chat, or maybe Tanya could do that if she has the capability. so that participants may be able to contact them later on. Okay, so Tanya or Adam, how would this work? Can we hear the audience, or will you tell us what the question is, please? Okay, Tanya or Adam? Okay, I can't hear them, so therefore I'm going to, okay, I'm sorry, just checking with my IT person. Okay, Danielle, thank you so much. We would like to invite the audience to put a question in the chat if they have one. But first, I would like to begin with a question to each or any of the panelists, and that is, each of you really made such compelling presentations today, and we're all the beneficiaries of it, so thank you. But my question to each of you is, where do you go next? Because implicit and explicit in many of your presentations was, again, this sort of reflection on the past and a sort of call to action. But where do we go? Where do we go from here in terms of unifying cross-racial boundaries? I would also argue, against across, gender, orientation, social class. Where do we go, and how do we get there? Nobody wants to be the first one to jump in. Okay, Rhonda?
It's a really important question. I would say that on the one hand, I'm heartened to know that we're already in progress with the answer to that. This engagement here today, and just in hearing some of what you all have been sharing about the things that you're doing, whether it's innovative scholarship and institution building within our disciplines, and the research that we're doing, whether it's litigation and public advocacy, representing individuals and representing causes, coalition building politically. I mean, so I think the good news is this is, it's a work in progress. I do think we often underestimate the challenge of working across difference. Or we know it's difficult, but we don't really think strategically and well about the skill building that can support us in navigating those difficult waters. We just sort of think if we come together with our well-meaning and our research and our backgrounds and our skills that we already have, that's going to be enough. But again, we're human animals. We're these soft-bellied creatures that are trained to other and kind of be afraid and to, be concerned about scarce resources. So I do think that you all know, I mean, embedding my view is if we can embed some intentionality around the interpersonal dynamics of working across difference, we're in a better position to do this. And there's a lot of research to help us, but I'm just sort of appalled at how little, the leaders, political and otherwise, who are out there trying to help us do this, they don't seem to be drawing on the research about how to do this, at least not in the way that I think we should be. And it really is I don't think we can afford these mistakes that I see in the public realm. So may we figure out a way to amplify what's possible.
Thank you, Professor Mcgee. Lena, please.
So I'll start from, I just want to say a few words from the public history point of view, and maybe Thomas can add a little bit later. But, in terms of the products, I'm just always Professor Mcgee was just talking about, we should go beyond the journal articles. I mean, which is important. We've been doing that, right? But the thing is, we were thinking about the complex history products, say, for example, the digital archives and also the museum exhibit. so walking tours, of this, history making process. Instead, we need to think beyond the academy, and based on solid research for sure. But, if you really want to mobile, I mean, one thing about, the public history is that, it's a mobilizing fact. You get people excited about their own history and invite them to be part of the history making process. And then they have to take a sense of ownership. And so we as public historians or whatever scholars, we help them to probably to design a kind of products, more complex, sustainable, and, so they can say, for example, community archives, digital archives, or, so they can use that later and to be, for their next generations, or even something sustainable, cross-generational, or, and nowadays, with the digital media, see we're doing what we're doing now, right? So I just get excited about, like this whole idea of, history remaking in the public space. And then we can think more about the products and because now we talk about prosumers instead of consumers or producer. We're talking about they're producing history, they're consuming history at the same time. So yeah, so that's just a thought, throw out. You can,
yeah, no, that was so awesome, and it's so particularly interesting that you and Professor Mcgee are side by side on my screen. So there's a collaborative work there. And Thomas, did you want to add anything at all?
Thank you. I don't know if I'm close to Lena on your screen.
Well, actually, you're about 3 persons down. So
I do agree with what you both said. Talking about the next step, I would mention the young generations. I'm first and foremost a teacher, a school teacher. I used to be teaching in a middle school, and for me, the next step is them. And I want to teach them better than I was taught, because when I went to school, and that's what most people who do not like history remember from school, is like, dates and boring stuff. And I was kind of trained this way. So for me, the next step is to help and to train new generations to, yes, do history, but be community builders and to, produce things with and build trust as well. So skills that I've never learned in school, that I think we should all learn in humanities, in public policy, in other disciplines. So for me, the next step would be to train them better than I was trained.
Love it. That's awesome. And we have just about 3 minutes left, but I want to get Dennis in. He has his hand up, and to close us out will be Dr. Young, who is the director of CBSI. So yes, Dennis, please.
Yes, I'm going to say something. I hope it doesn't offend all of you academians, but I think we got to stop talking. We got to stop lecturing. We got to stop writing, and we need to start doing things together. And that's the reason why a lot of the activities that I've been engaged in the past few years, I've been actively engaged with other communities. I have probably been involved in 6 or 7 meetings with the NAACP. We've been involved in activities with the JCRC. We're doing outreach with other organizations. And I don't think there's any better way for unity than for people to actually unite and do things together. Remember that in the Second World War, until we all worked together, we all fought together, we all bled together, we all died together, that we prevailed over evil. Okay.
Recording
so
in
much,
progress.
Wisdom here, knowledge, amazing. I just can't thank you enough for spending time here at the USF with our audience, and share your knowledge with us, your insights, and a lot of great idea messages going to take away by our audience. So I want to thank a few definitely thank a few people. If I can have slide up, could I have a slide share here? Tanya, Adam? Could I hear from me? But of course, I want to thank everyone here, the speakers, wonderful, fabulous speakers from across different areas, different regions. And a couple people, my provost, I know she noticed she stayed on for quite a while, but as you know, she's too busy. I want to thank her for making the opening speech. And I want to thank my dean for appearing. And I noticed that one of my organizer, Liang, is not here. So I want to thank Liang and Richard, have spent a lot of energy organizing this event. And for all my wonderful speakers, Ella, Thomas, William, Lena, Rhonda, and Dennis, I just can't thank you enough. And Lena, yes, particularly for initiating this idea, brought the proposal to us. Fabulous, bring more. I can only say that. So Tanya, could I have the next slide? It looks like I can share my own screen, I suppose, right? Okay, here you go, perfect. So I really want to thank, a few individuals here. And they are the producer for today's event. Daniel Glenn, she is the Senior Director, External Engagement. And Tanya is Operation Employee Relations Manager. Adam Anders, who he actually produced the YouTube, make all live streaming for us. So I want to thank you for partnering with Cbsi. We have started this wonderful partnership now, and they have done such a professional, wonderful job for us. So thank you so much. I definitely want to thank all the sponsors and the partners for this event. Deloitte International Federation for Public History, Center for Public History at Zhejiang University in Hangzhou, China. I used to live there. The USF Jesuit Foundation Grant Initiative, the 6+U Initiative, and they have provided some funding for this event. Cbsi, those of you who don't know, let me boast a little bit. Cbsi is actually the San Francisco, Silicon Valley-based knowledge center, thought leader, and the relationship builder for businesses in US, China, Asia, and the rest of the world. And we are actually the only research center at the USF that focuses on international business. And touching issues like this, diversity, it is international. And we leverage Jesuits' historical connection to China and Asia, and 500 years of Jesuit tradition of linking global education with commerce. And we regularly host events like this. And so we want you to stay tuned for our next year, 2020 events. And this is our last major event for this year. So I want to thank you, my dear audience, for joining us today. And I want to thank everyone. And thank you. And stay safe and keep the conversation going. And make sure you meditate, take Rhonda and my provost advice, meditate every day, think about deeply the issue and take action, as Dennis said. Don't just stop at the thinking and writing. Take action yourself each day, every day in your own life. That's how we can move the needle forward. We can make a change from where we are. So I wish you everyone good luck and all the best in your life. Cura personale. And thank you. Have a great day.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Shawa.
Thank you.
Excellent panel.
Thanks,
I'm
everyone.
back in the future.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thomas, thanks for staying up.